If we have a look at some of the Islamic countries like Morocco, Algeria, Tanzania, Egypt, Libya, Jordan, and even Iraq, Afghanistan and Yemen, they all have two things in common that make them unique. For one thing, they have big problems with money, and for another, they are strongly rooted in the Islamic traditions. Most Muslim majority countries have terrible economies. Their average GDP per capita is about 5,000 less than the world average. The only exceptions are the oil-rich Gulf monarchies. So why exactly is that the case? Let's dig right into the topic to understand why. Historians are growing interested in this strange difference in income, which has led to a lot of study and lively debates. Out of all the ideas that have been put forward, two have stuck with people. For one point of view, the Islamic faith and society seems to be inherently against progress, as they seem to reject ideas like trade democracy. Surprisingly, only 40% of Muslims live in a democracy, even though 60% of the world's countries are democratic. On the other hand, another common theory says that Muslim countries' economic problems are not caused by their religious views, but by the effects of Western colonization in the past. This point of view stresses how colonization was unfair and how it still affects these countries today. But it's important to remember that even though colonization and cultural factors certainly played a big part, they may not be the main reason why the Islamic world is having economic problems. A long time ago, the Muslim Middle East was one of the biggest economies. During the Middle Ages, around the year 1000, this area made a huge 10% of the world GDP, far more than Europe, which was stuck in the Dark Ages. The Islamic world in the Middle Ages was the birthplace of many important innovations, such as mathematics, modern medicine, and irrigation systems. This shows that these areas were pretty well off, even though most of the people there were Muslim, showing that religion wasn't stopping them from being successful. In terms of colonism, it's interesting to note that by the 1700s, the Islamic world's share of global GDP had dropped to just 2.2%. This showed that things were getting worse long before colonism. This means that colonism can't be blamed for their bad economy on its own. What happened in the Islamic world between the 10th and the 16th century that stopped its economic growth all of a sudden? What tactics did Europe use that these countries didn't see? Before we get to answering these questions, here's a polite reminder that if you like our content, don't forget to go ahead and subscribe to our channel. Thank you. So, looking into the court records of Istanbul and Galati in the 1600s shows an interesting fact. Almost 80% of businesses were companies with only two people. Big companies like the British East India Company, which had hundreds of owners, were missing. Since the beginning of the modern era, most Islamic companies have been small and have had trouble growing. For example, big banks like the Bank of Amsterdam started to appear in Europe in the 1600s, but it didn't start to appear in the Middle East until the late 1800s, a huge gap of 200 years. What caused the Islamic world to be so far behind, especially in its business world, which always seemed so small? A lack of businesses is often a sign of a lack of growth and new ideas. That being said, what caused this to happen? There are many reasons for this, but three stand out as being especially important. In Muslim countries, the Quran was very strict about inheritance and pushed for fair sharing among children. This stopped parents from giving the oldest child the whole estate, which is common in the West today, but wasn't done in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. But this method, which seems progressive, had some problems. During these times, Muslim countries used polygamy, which produced many children and as a result, a large loss of inheritance. This caused a big problem. At the time, business rules said that companies had to shut down when their owner died, so heirs who wanted to keep their family business going had to start over, which was hard to do because the wealth was spread out. Another problem was that inheritance was not always clear, making it hard for an owner to save enough money to start up and run the business again. Because they knew this, many business owners didn't feel motivated to make long-term plans for their companies because they knew that their businesses would probably fail after they died. As a result, there wasn't much reason to start a big business. But that wasn't the end of the problems. Remember how we said earlier that the Islamic world was slow to open big banks? This had a huge effect on businesses. Before banks, it was hard to get loans to start a business or grow an existing one. In Islam, loans with interest have generally been illegal. This rule lasted longer than in places like the Christian West. On the other hand, religious leaders often supported creative loan options that were legal under Islamic law. For example, a loan could look like a deal to sell something for a different amount of money. Because of all of this, French companies could borrow money at an average rate of about 5%, but Ottoman companies had to borrow money at more than 20%. The high interest rate penalty slowed down banking in general and led to the creation of bills of exchange, which were one of the most important innovations of the Middle Ages. Italian merchants could move without carrying cash if they had these letters, and these checks could work in the numbers of different currencies between countries. This financial science was closely linked to the progress made in banking, which included well-known families like the Medici. On the other hand, many traders in the Middle East kept sailing the sea with chests full of gold, which made their ships easy targets for pirates and bandits. There was a type of bills of exchange in the area that existed before the European counterparts, but they were rare and didn't have the same level of freedom as bills of exchange in Europe. Starting a business was already hard enough, and this made it even harder. The problem of justice was another thing that kept Western investors away. The Ottoman courts were not reliable at all. At first, these judges, who were religious leaders, didn't put much stock in written papers like contracts. Yes, you heard that right. In Istanbul, in the 18th century, contracts were used as proof in only 3% of cases. In the other 93, oral testimony from many people was enough. In the Christian world, on the other hand, contracts were required as proof in all business cases before 1400s. Who do you think won when there were different testimonials in a system where oral evidence was important? The judges mostly followed two rules. When there was a trial between a Muslim and a non-Muslim, the Muslim won, and when there was a trial between people of the same religion, the richer person won. It was sadly common for these people to be corrupt. Regardless, the explanation given so far isn't quite full. A lot of these problems weren't just in the Islamic world, they were also in the Christian countries, like the fact that the interest-bearing loans were illegal. In this way, the Islamic world wasn't exactly going back, it was just failing to grow. They weren't getting poorer, they were just not getting richer. Not only did wealth stay the same, but so did work contract and the way people formed partnerships, which didn't change much in over 1,000 years. At the same time, Europeans were always coming up with new ways to run their businesses. In the end, the sin of interest faded, and these restrictions were slowly lifted. There was a big impact on business methods from the Islamic legal framework. As we already said, Islamic law didn't allow loans with interest, which made it harder for businesses to get the money they needed to grow. Also, the fact that some economic activities or goods were illegal, like alcohol and pork, limited the types of business possibilities that were open. These religious rules made it hard for Islamic societies to participate in some businesses that were going well in the West and making a lot of money. Second, the economic growth was slowed by the fact that many Islamic countries did not have well-developed financial institutions, like banks and stock markets. During the 17th century, powerful banks like the Bank of Amsterdam started to appear in Europe. However, the Middle East did not have any similar institutions until almost 200 years later. Businesses would have a hard time getting capital, making risks, and making big investments without good financial middlemen. For the fourth reason, the Islamic world was very politically divided, with many dynasties, empires, and regional powers competing for power. Different leaders often had policies and interests that were at odds with each other, which made economic integration and cooperation harder. Europe, on the other hand, had more political stability over time, which made it possible for larger, more unified economic networks to form. Things like culture and society also played a big part. Traditional values and ways of doing things, like favouring small family businesses over big corporations, stayed the same. Entrepreneurship and economic innovation could be slowed down by social hierarchy, such as the power of religious leaders and the wealthy elite. Invasive war and colonization, along with other geopolitical conflicts and outside pressures, slowed down economic activity in many Islamic regions. Because of these wars, resources and attention were taken away from the economic growth, which made the economy less stable. Back then, there were big differences in how people got educated and how much information they could get. During the Middle Ages, Islamic scholars made important contributions to many fields. However, over time, the system for education and sharing knowledge became less effective. In Europe, on the other hand, the Renaissance and Enlightenment saw a return to learning that led to big steps forward in science, philosophy, and technology. Also, people who wanted to start their own businesses had a hard time because many Islamic societies didn't have strong entrepreneurial ecosystems. It was hard to get mentors, business networks, and venture capital, all of which are important building a successful ecosystem for entrepreneurs. So, even though Islamic societies had economic problems, it is important to remember their economic stagnation was caused by a lot of complicated interconnecting factors. Some of these factors were religious and legal restrictions, institutional barriers, problems with intellectual property, political fragmentation, differences in culture and social norms, geological pressures, educational gaps, and the lack of entrepreneurial ecosystem. For similar content, don't forget to have a look at some of the other videos on your screen.